We are a few minutes past the hour, so hopefully most people have joined us, and we'll just go ahead and get started. So everybody, thank you for being here. Welcome to the Grow Farmer Forum on cover crop termination. I'm Emily Unglesbee. I'm the Director of Outreach and Extension for Grow, and we have a really great farmer panel lined up for you guys. Before we get to that, just a couple housekeeping things. This is a webinar format, so unless you're a panelist, you shouldn't be able to talk. And we have a Q&A box at the bottom that you should be able to see where you can enter your questions. We'll have two folks, Dr. Michael Flesner from Virginia Tech and Dr. Mark Van Gessel from the University of Delaware, monitoring that, and they will chime in with questions if it works to answer it quickly during the flow of things, but I think we will save most of them for the end, where we can have sort of an open conversation. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we will be offering CCA credits, and we'll have details on how to access those at the end of the webinar. So just hang on tight and watch all of it, and we'll get those to you. Otherwise, before I introduce our speakers, I just want to do a quick little plug. I hope most of you know Grow. Well, maybe I won't do a quick little plug. There we go. If not, Grow is a network of weed scientists who are sort of coordinating research on integrated weed management strategies with the goal of helping farmers fight herbicide resistance. I would really encourage everybody to go to our website listed here. You can subscribe and you'll get just a weekly email with news and research updates on IWM from across the country. And there's also a lot of great resources there on managing weeds with and without chemicals. So we also have several social media accounts. You can find us on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram and Facebook. So wherever you are, I've put our handles here. Hopefully you can find us. And one final plug, hopefully everyone knows the cover crop councils. I've put their URLs up here, the Northeastern one, Southern, Midwest, and Western. Great resources on cover cropping with very region specific information there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to ask our farmer panelists and our one weed scientist panelist to introduce themselves just very briefly, where you are, what you grow, and then we will jump into our cover crop discussion. So Wisconsin Jim, because we have two Jims, I'm going to let you start.
All right, well, thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. Jim Studi. I'm from East Troy, Wisconsin. That's in southeast Wisconsin. I'm roughly 30 miles southwest of Milwaukee and 20 miles from the Illinois state line, and close enough to Lake Michigan to have a pronounced lake effect. So on my farm, I grow no-till corn and soybeans. I've been no-till for the last 20 years and cover crops since the beginning. So that's 30 years.
Thank you, Jim. How about our other Jim Hershey from Pennsylvania?
Good afternoon. Thanks for asking me to join this panel this afternoon. I think we got a good group, but yeah, I'm from southeast Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, to be specific, but we raise broiler chickens. We market about 1.75 million broiler chickens a year. We also have corn, wheat, soybeans, and I like to say we raise cover crops too, because that's just you know, part of our program right now. Been no-tilling for more than 30 years, probably close to 35 years. Been planting green, using cover crops. Well, using cover crops for probably somewhere in 15-year range, 15 to 17. And then been planting green for going on 9 years now. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Jim. And Clay from Virginia, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Clay Lowe. I'm from Wakefield, Virginia, which is in the kind of the southeastern corner. Mostly sandy coastal plains soils where we're at. It's cotton and peanut country. Those are our sort of bread and butter crops, but we also raise corn and soy and a host of small grains. We're major biomass cover crop farmers, I like to say, because we're sort of farm biomass when we're producing our cover crops, and strong advocates of no-till. Been doing it for about 15 years. When I got back from NC State, we were moldboard plowing still, and now we're planting in the head high rye. So it's been a fun ride.
That's great. Thank you, Clay. And John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into the meat of this.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and good afternoon. My name is John Wallace. I'm an extension weed specialist at Penn State, in the middle of the state in State College. And so I focus on field and forage crops, and my extension and research program, I would say, has a emphasis in weed management and no-till systems and cover cropping systems.
Great, thank you. So the first topic I want each of the farmers to sort of share on is what cover crops you use currently on your farm. If you're using any mixtures, what are they, and what's your primary goals in using cover crops? What are you trying to accomplish? And since Jim's studio in Wisconsin will probably be the last to plant, we'll let him go first here and answer that.
So I'm totally corn and beans now. I used to grow wheat, and so when I grew wheat, the driver there was the nitrogen credit. So I should just say up front, I'm totally drunk the soil health Kool-Aid. That's not one of my considerations. That's with whatever economic benefit that I'm looking for. So it's all cereal rye, and this will be the second year it's after both crops or before both crops. And the reason I do it is for soil moisture management, and then specifically in soybeans to manage glyphosate resistant weeds that I've got on my farm. And I've got some slides to show you when we get into the termination discussion. So it's those two things. But I use adaptive management. So if I've got soil moisture, I let it grow as long as my gut says it's okay. And then I terminate because I want to produce biomass. My soil type is a lighter silt loam soil, around 2% organic matter. So the more biomass I can produce, the better.
Nice, great. What about you down in Pennsylvania, Jim? What are you growing and why?
So we typically grow two different mixes, I guess I would say, primarily. So we have what we call an early mix, which I like to get planted by the first week in October, and then the second mix comes later after a field gets too late to get to any benefit out of any legumes. But the early mix this past year, we used oats, rye, clover, radish, some barley, and then we've already used triticale, oats, and flax in that mix. We've been mixing it up, but we have in the past been using some winter peas that there needs to be planted early, and then some vetch. Most recently, in the last couple of years, we have been raising seed wheat, and so the vetch has become a bit of an issue for us. So we just can't have vetch in our seed wheat. So we're backing off of that, but I do like to get some legumes in early. Probably there's a number of reasons I find it useful. Is one thing Jim touched on there was organic matter. I like to raise as much biomass as I can, and I'm trying to, and been pretty successful at raising organic matters, but it's been a very, very slow process. I'm happy to get a 10th or 2% increase, year to year, but that's sometimes I see it go the other way too. The other thing is feeding feeding our microbes, to recycle nutrients is a huge thing. And I think as long as we have something green living there in the soil, something to keep those microbes alive, they need to eat too. But I think my biggest benefit that I've seen, a dramatic benefit, is that I've had reduced weed pressure. These cover crops, especially if you're rolling them, planting them green, it's an excellent herbicide, if you want to say.
Great, thank you, Jim. What about you, Clay? What are you working with down there?
Yeah, it sounds very similar to Jim. I think maybe our window is a little longer. A lot of times here, corn is coming off Labor Day weekend. And if that's the case, we can get somebody in the drill following the combine, and we can get, we'll plant sunflowers, buckwheat, cowpea, a lot of things that will kill off with the first frost. We'll have maybe 60 days probably here before the first frost. So we kind of can utilize a lot of those warmer seasons. Sun hemp is one that's a really aggressive growing warm season that we use. And we kind of position it depending on what crop we're going into. So I mentioned coming off of corn, oftentimes that'll be going into cotton the next year, which I don't know if you northerners know, but that's also a nitrogen thirsty crop. So we try to position legumes in front of cotton as well. Use a lot of vetch, hairy vetch, use a lot of Austrian winter pea. Mostly got into that because it was a cheaper alternative to vetch. When I'm doing my spreadsheet and I'm trying to come up with my mix, when you look at the cost, you can substitute some Austrian winter pea for hairy vetch and get it on down. And then we use a lot of Abruzzi rye. Black oats have been good the past few years. And we use some tillage radishes as well. So our sands they're sugar sand light, and we're trying really hard to keep them covered and grow as much biomass as we can to try to build those soils.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we have a lot of different species experience on this panel, which is great. I think we'll keep the process of starting with Jim Studi up north and then proceeding southward for the rest of these questions, if that works for the panelists, and you guys can just jump up when the farmer in front of you is done. So to get to sort of the meat of our webinar here, let's talk about terminating those cover crops. And Jim, I think we're most interested in when you do it. And I know it's a very different situation up north. You have a much shorter growing season. So when and how and what you're getting from that. Do you want me to share your slide set right now?
Yes, please. So I should have mentioned a little bit about planting. So I just heard Labor Day weekend. So I finished up planting after corn stalks on December 5th of last year. And that was kind of late. And what I had to wait was for the frost in the ground to get rotten so I could get the drill through it. So anyway, we don't get near the biomass, I imagine, that you people in the south get, or even to the east to me. So termination, I'm driven by two things. The first one is moisture management. So I've got a picture of termination time on my farm last year, but I want to look at my weather data. So I've kept weather data on the farm since I've been here, starting in '94. And really what we're seeing is a change in weather patterns. And the last 5 years have just been crazy. So the top part of the graph in the red, that's the annual total of the growing season, April through October, and then the mean, and this is just a constant mean. If I was graphing a 10-year rolling mean, you'd see it would slope upward. We've gained almost 3 inches in total precipitation in the 30 years I've been on the farm. But anyway, the last 5 years, I've had the wettest year, the second wettest year, and the driest year on the farm. And then 2 years that graph out as average, but they were far from average. We got the moisture in garbage time, and that really didn't help our crops. And so we got the drought year of 21, and then 22, an average year in Wisconsin. We got 6 inches of rainfall in April and early May, which slowed us down as far as Springfield work. And then summer, it quit raining. We were on the drought monitor for about a month, and then it started raining again. So we had bookends of really wet and then dry in between. And so being fed up with what that's done, I decided cover crop, cereal rye on everything, and then manage it according to conditions. Next slide, please. So then the other thing is I've got resistant weeds on my farm. So I've got the mare's tail and the water hemp that everyone else has, but I also have a population of giant ragweed, which was confirmed resistant by glyphosate resistant by University of Wisconsin-Madison weed scientists. I got confirmation last year. It was a 5-year process from digging up the plants to confirming it. And in my resistance report that I got last year, I found that not only am I resistant to glyphosate, but also some other herbicides, an ALS inhibitor, chloranthalum, which I've used once prior to this test, and then a PPO inhibitor, Fomacin, which I've never used on my farm. So this is kind of a vexing problem. And you might say, I mean, so grow is about managing the glyphosate resistance. So I've got multiple resistance on my farm in this ragweed patch, but also a really disturbing trend. So we've got these new products that we can use, Enlist or Extend, or we could use Liberty, or we could use some of the older products. But I'm really worried about developing new resistance. And the picture that's in the bottom right-hand corner is a giant ragweed on my farm. And this is about a week after the first exposure to Enlist. And you look at it, it's malformed, but it's grown, it's green and growing, and its colleagues around it are dying. And so I am really concerned about developing new resistance. So this is where termination fits into this. Next slide, please. So with corn, so I want the option, I plant green, and I want the option of being able to let it grow. But in corn, I am scared of going beyond planting green. And so I am routinely terminating with the application of my pre-emergent herbicide. So I turn around right after planting and I'm back on the field. This is what I'm using, the glyphosate to terminate the rye, and then my pre-emergence, which I heat up with oil and ammonium sulfate to treat it as a post-emergence application to take care of any of the glyphosate resistant weeds that I have on the farm. The reason for doing that, I'll share with you in a minute. In soybeans, I practice adaptive management. I want to put a pre-emergence out there, and so that's sulfentrazone and chloranthalum, so authority first, and that's to take care of the resistant glyphosate and the other species that I have. If I have weeds that are out there, I will also put Enlist in there to control them. So I'm starting clean and trying to stay clean. And then depending on soil moisture, I will terminate sooner or later, depends on the year and what my gut tells me. On the research side of my career, and I didn't mention that, so I'm an independent research agronomist, also working primarily in cover crop economics and yield response, but also on resistance management. So it's a gut feeling now, but we're trying to get to a point where we can tell you based on growth stage of either rye or soybean, we don't know what that is yet. Well, let's terminate based on the weather forecast. So that's my program. It seems like a lot, but I am managing to prevent further resistance and trying to prevent setting seed in what I've got. So back to corn and the next slide. What really drives me is the fear of the critical weed-free period. So this has been well-researched, well-documented. And what critical weed-free period says is corn does not want to see anything green and growing next to it, either a young weed or a cover crop from emergence up until sometime around V8 to V12. And so what the corn plant does is it senses light, and it's either reflectance or what gets absorbed, And that tells it it's got competition. It's other corn plants or it's something else. And that influences yield potential. So early on, the corn establishes its yield potential, how many rows of kernels, how many ears, how many rows of kernels, how many kernels there are going to be per row. And either a weed or a cover crop can influence that. And I've seen enough disasters and research plots to know that this is a real phenomenon. We better honor it. Next slide, please. And so here's some evidence from my farm last year. So I'm part of a large SARE-funded project here in Southeast Wisconsin called Cover Crops Pay. And it's a real simple on-farm trial with 3 treatments, no cover. And in my case, I've got the rye, which I burned down before planting, and then adaptive management, so post-emergence termination. And so the picture you see here is of my plots on corn planting day, May 11th. And this is just 3 days after we've applied the glyphosate to burn it down. Next to it is green, actively growing rye. My actual dates, because it was hot, because it turned dry, I decided to terminate the post-emergence early. So there's only 11 days of spread between the 2 different termination timing. And if you look at the data, you'll see that that shows up in corn yield. So virtually no difference between the no rye and the pre-plant burn down, slight yield reduction, a bushel the acre, but I attribute that just to noise in the data. But there's an 11 bushel yield difference from the late termination compared to the no rye treatment. And I attribute that for the most part to the critical green free period, and I violated that. So it shows up in the yield, and that's really what I'm scared of. Next slide, please. So in soybeans, we're looking at a trade-off between suppression of weeds by letting it grow and yield reduction. So the data I'm showing here is from another on-farm trial that I conducted with a group of farmers in a neighboring county. And so we were looking at planting green and seeing how much could we suppress these glyphosate-resistant weeds. And they've got the same pressures that I've got there. So 3 treatments. We had no rye that we terminate at planting time. And then we let the rye grow to anthesis. So it's the maximum amount of biomass that we can produce. And the idea there is more biomass, more suppression, whether it comes from allelopathy, whether it comes from direct competition, or if it comes from suppression or interference from the rye biomass. So our data on the left-hand column, 2 select data sets, mare's tail, which was ubiquitous. So this was at all sites, all years. This is 2021 when we had a lot of pressure. And what our data shows compared to no rye, and let me back up, the same residual applied at the same time is on all these treatments. So the only difference is when we applied the glyphosate early in the case of the pre-treatment, the at planting treatment, or late at the anthesis. So what we saw universally, and this is across weed species too, so mare's tail at the top and giant rag at the bottom, is a roughly 50% reduction in populations at the time we're going to treat with our post-emergence herbicide for the rye that was terminated at planting. And then the really late termination, we get an additional 40 to 45% suppression. So we're suppressing them down to almost nothing. So that's the good news from a weed management standpoint. It's bad news from a soybean yield standpoint. In 2021, a drought year, we reduced soybean yield compared to control by 29%. We actually saw a yield bump in both years of 2 to 3%, just response to the cover crop. And then a year when we had ample moisture to finish out the year, 2022, we had a 14% yield reduction, still unacceptable. So what that tells me is somewhere between terminating at planting and the really late termination is a sweet spot where we're not reducing yield, where we can maybe capture that yield bump from the at planting termination, but we're also increasing yield suppression of the weeds. And that's what I professionally am out to do. And we've got new funding. We've got plots in the ground this year. In a couple of years, I'll be reporting on that. In my next slide, I'm going to show you some anecdotal photographic evidence that shows that indeed this exists. So the first picture, the one on the left, is one I showed right at my introduction. And this is shortly after planting, and this is in soybeans. And you can see the ground's still dry, but the forecast says that long-term forecast is going to be dry. The weather's hot. I'm thinking I need to terminate. So this is the field that all my soybean research was in. So about a week after this photo was taken, I decided to terminate the rye. And I started this field. It got dark. The idea was that I would come back the next day and finish up before it got windy. That didn't happen. It got really windy overnight. It was windy for 8 days. I was locked out for 8 days. The rye grew an additional foot. And what it looked like at termination time is the center picture. So this is a couple of days after the glyphosate application for termination. And what's really interesting in this picture is there are rows, there are streaks of really green rye. Those were the rye rows right over where the starter herbicide or starter fertilizer was applied. So it got the benefit of some additional nitrogen and sulfur. And I look at the efficacy of the glyphosate application, and with the fortification of that additional nutrient and being a little bit taller, it didn't terminate as well. Ultimately, it died and it formed the mat, which is what you see on the picture on the right-hand side. And so that's what the mat looked like at, this is 4th of July weekend. Those are really moisture stressed beans, but I've got a mat there that's conserving whatever little bit of rainfall we got and suppressing weeds. So on the weed suppression side, the areas that I had sprayed early and got the early termination, about 2 weeks later, I was back with Enlist, taking care of a flush of mare's tail that came on in that very short period of time. That didn't happen until later in the late terminated rye. So at the end of the day, the early sprayed stuff had to get sprayed with Enlist post-emergence twice, whereas the much later termination only once. My yield reduction was about a bushel to the acre with the later terminated compared to the control on my research plot. So I can't compare, that's apples to oranges. I had a yield reduction, but nowhere near what I thought I was going to get. But it still concerns me. So ultimately, professionally, what we're trying to get at is when do you make the termination timing based on soybean growth stage and then based on what the weather says, what the weather forecast says. And that's it for my termination.
Thank you, Jim. That was interesting. So that's chemical only termination. And Jim, in Pennsylvania, are you roller crimping too? What's your termination look like?
Yeah, so yes, I am roller crimping, but I will add that there is still need for herbicide. We have reduced herbicide rates, but we have not been able to totally eliminate them. Emily, if you want to pull up the heavy cover crop slide. There you go. So this is crazy, Jim. There are times when we have delayed planting corn in order to produce more biomass on our field. This here field got a bit out of hand. I think some of it had to do with manure application early in the spring, and some of it actually became lodged, as you can see at the bottom of the picture there, where it was laying over. I would not suggest or even ask my worst enemy to even attempt to do anything like this unless you really, really have experience and are very confident. It takes the right equipment and obviously a lot of guts, but this here would have been mostly cereal rye. There's probably some clover in there that you really can't see from this picture, but we actually had a decent stand. I did not send over a photo, but in that same field, we all the time are doing our own on-farm research. In that same field, we had strip trials. If you look at the sort of the top left, you'll see a brown streak up there, right in there. And then there's one over to the far right. We do our own research where we burned off the cover at about 6-8 inches. We really wanted to see the benefits or the pros and cons of heavy cover versus I would say down and brown method. And two things we observed at harvest time. We had some broadleaf weed escapes in the area where we did the down and brown. In the heavy cover, we did not see that. But the yield monitor told us something that we didn't want to see. And that unfortunately was that the down and brown did about 12 bushel better. So I need to remind myself, why am I doing this? And I keep going back to the fact that it's healthier for the soil. It might not be the economics that you can see on paper, but I feel I had better water infiltration. I had better weed management, and hopefully I had better microbial activity, and of course the weed issue. If you want to go to the one, the slide that has the roller crimper on the, yeah, you can do that one. That there's a picture of our planter. It's a Case IH 1250 with the Dawn ZRX roller on. We have two fertilizer systems on. One, we put an in-furrow starter pop-up, and then the second system has a nitrogen system on where we put beside the row in back of the press wheel. If you want to go back, Emily, to the picture before that, there's, if you're not familiar with the Dawn ZRX roller, it has its own row cleaner on that you can adjust how aggressive you want it. You can also adjust the roller itself as to how much down pressure you want. Our early years of planting green did not come without challenges. You definitely need to hear and listen to other producers, farmers that have been doing it, because there's been some that wrapped their closing wheels, they've wrapped row cleaners in a big ball of cover, and that is just makes for a very long day. You want to go to the soybean planting in the soybean, that one right there. So we don't roll we plant everything green, corn and soybeans. Soybeans, we do not roll. For some reason, it seems like that soybeans can tolerate shade more than others, or more than corn can. And the caution I would put out there for everyone that is, if you're planting cover crop, I think the biggest mistake that is made many, many times is they think, well, we're planting cover, we have to plant it thick. And there is folks that have turned away from cover because of bad experiences. We typically don't plant more than a total of 45 pounds, maybe occasionally 50 pounds of a mix. That's total. That's the rye, the vetch, radish, whatever it might be, will not exceed that. It doesn't look like you have much in the fall or sometimes even going into winter, but when you come to planting green, you just don't want a real thick cover. And I think I have one more there. The one in the middle. So this is what I want to see. Talking about weed management and moisture management, you can't get it any better than that. But it doesn't always look like that. This past summer, we were in an area that was extremely dry, probably the driest we've seen it in 30 years. And I took a soil thermometer out into the field where I had where I showed you we had the down in brown and where we had this heavy cover, and there was a difference of 12 degrees. It was 12 degrees cooler where I had this heavy cover than where it was down in brown. The corn looked less stressed, and I feel that just the lower temperature, and I did not take any moisture level readings, but I don't know at that point if there was much difference. I think it was mostly the soil temperature that was, you just didn't have that heat coming off and hitting the corn leaves either. It had to be cooler in the when that was canopied over. Now that corn was, it was tasseled, so the rows were closed. It was much farther advanced in the picture you see here, but so I mentioned that we had a yield advantage over the down and brown. I guess there's a trade-off. I would have to tell you that we've seen this 3 years in a row now, that there was a yield bump in where we did the down and brown. But I don't feel like I was doing our soil any helping our soil, and that's what I want to do. I think that's all I have to share right now.
Thanks, Jim. How about you, Clay? When are you terminating, and how are you doing it in Southeast Virginia?
Yeah, well, obviously depending on the crops, I think so we've seen what Jim was describing as well, and I have actually gone to a little bit different system where I sort of focus on building the soil harder with carbon. If you want to talk about the C to N ratio, I think what he's seeing there is probably, the soil eats first and your crops eat second. And if he's got a high C to N ratio crop like that huge rye out there, he's essentially planting into a zero nitrogen environment with his corn. I don't mind that with soybeans, but we've actually tried this past year a little bit of a management annoyance, you might say, but a practice to try to help that. We planted our rye with vetch going into corn. And I think if you want to show the first group of pictures, Emily, I think it'll be a good, so these would be behind peanuts. So I think Yeah, so that picture was taken 2 weeks ago on our farm. And that's a Bruzzy rye and hairy vetch. That was behind peanuts. I think both of those crops really got like a rocket boost from the nitrogen releasing. Peanuts are a legume. So as those vines break down, it sort of has fed these cover crops. So a lot of these ideas, we come up with ourselves, and then sometimes we come up with them from a mentor. Paul Davis is a farmer and a researcher who's north of the James River from me. If you remember your early American history, Jamestown, I'm south of the James River. He's just north of it. And he's developed a program, and I give him credit for this because it's a brilliant program. You plant your rye with your vetch. You're able to capture whatever program payments are out there from your soil and water district by having your rye out there growing. Then once you reach the program date that they allow you to terminate, we're going out with a low rate of clethodim. I use 9 ounces of a 2-pound clethodim, and I sprayed that with about 20 units of nitrogen. And that's going to kill my rye off and allow my vetch to just overtake the field. The 20 pounds of nitrogen acts like another rocket boost for it. And my plan is to plant into that vetch green, plant corn into that green, hopefully at 50% bloom of the vetch. So that's sort of determining my planting date. I'm going to terminate it right after the planter because just like Wisconsin Jim was saying, I think you see a lot of corn lost there from competition. So I want to kill it. When that corn comes up, I don't want it to have any competition. So I'm going to kill the vetch behind the planter, but I am going to plant it green to allow it to accumulate as much nitrogen as it can in the soil. And I don't think I'm building the soil as much as I would if I did what Jim was doing, but I'm trying to hit a happy medium. Now on soybean years, I'm letting that rye grow and go. If you can go to the next slide, Emily. So that was just kind of a picture of how tall it was. I'm not super tall, but that's above my knee. And like I said, that was 2 weeks ago. And then the next one should show that same field. This morning I was out there. No, sorry, that's still from 2 weeks ago. Yeah, maybe it's group 2 in the second group of pictures. I was out there this morning. That's after the clethodim spray. So that's 9 ounces of a 2-pound clethodim. And you can see that the rye it's slow. It's been kind of chilly. Clethodim is a slow acting product. That's Select. That's a slow acting product, but it is killing the rye down, and the vetch is certainly taking over and becoming the dominant species. And I believe I show a couple more pictures of that. Yeah, so that's just showing the vetch. The vetch is pretty unharmed by the clethodim spray, and you can see the rye turning brown and curling up and dying there. And that's just kind of giving you a height, another height sort of reference point there of where my vetch is. And then, like I said, this will probably be planted in the next 3 weeks. We'll plant it, and I have rollers on my planter that will roll it down. They're just shop built ones. And we roll it down, and then I'll spray it and terminate it out behind the planter. The next group of slides. So this cover crop was planted behind peanuts. So it would have been probably the second week of October when we got the cover crop planted. This group of pictures shows cover crop that was planted probably mid-November. So about a month later, and the difference in the growth is astonishing. It was being overtaken by winter annuals like chickweed and henbit, dead nettle, those type of things. And so I wanted my vetch to grow, but I wanted to help it out and get this is behind cotton going into corn. So I actually sprayed this with a quart of simazine. And if you can see sort of the remnants of the chickweed there in the lower left, or the lower right corner. It did a fantastic job. That was a quart rate of a 4-pound simazine product. And you can see the Austrian pea there. It did sort of sort of speckle those leaves, but I think they're going to be okay. The vetch looks completely unharmed. I was a little nervous about this because I didn't know whether it was going to harm my vetch or not, but in this scenario, that was just something that I'm trying this year. It's an extra step management wise. It's an extra cost, but again, I'm trying to give those legumes in a corn rotation every benefit of the doubt that I can to sort of grow and take over and make as much nitrogen for me as I can. And it's a few more slides from that same field. Yeah, there's sort of a picture of it where it's just, you can't really see anything but weeds. That's a month different planting date. How critical that is in the fall. I think this kind of illustrates that as well. But yeah, and that just kind of shows the chickweed there. You can see it was a little bluegrass in there. It didn't harm that, unfortunately. And then again, you see a little speckling on the Austrian winter peas, but I think they're going to be fine. And these are just some practices that we've been doing this year. Extra management step, yes, but we feel like it's going to pay just because we're trying to, in this specific case of going into corn, I'm trying to maximize nitrogen production without sort of a carbon penalty, where as if I was in 6 foot tall rye. And that's just a little twist on some of the herbicide management that we're trying this year. In soybeans, I want all my soybean fields to look just like Jim's. I don't always achieve it, but that's exactly what I want my soybean fields to look like. I want huge biomass rye. I want it rolled down. Because I've found that if you leave it standing, we do a lot of double crop soybeans as well, and we harvest the wheat with a stripper head. And if you don't roll it down, it seems like your soybeans get really tall and spindly, and they get sort of a weak stalk on them. And so I prefer to roll down the biomass because it allows that plant to intercept more sunlight. Whereas if you leave a high biomass standing, it seems like the plants have to compete more. And I also just want it down on the ground for weed suppression, and it starts its nutrient cycling as well faster, I think. So that's kind of the approach we take.
Maybe you mentioned this, Clay, and I missed it. What do you spray the vetch with after corn planting?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So vetch, Roundup will kill vetch. If I've got clover in it, Roundup won't kill clover. So a lot of times it's Liberty. And then I'll use an auxin of your choice. For me, it's dicamba because our cotton is predominantly dicamba tolerant. So I try to keep that the same so we don't have any mess ups. And that's kind of the approach we take. If I do have a huge biomass of a mix, something that I do think helps is we use our cotton defoliation nozzles, which it's like a 21 gallon to the acre rate. And so it really penetrates the canopy well. And it's a dual fan type of spray. Probably not the best for an auxin as far as containment, but it does make, like something like Liberty, it really helps. Really covering it and penetrating that dense canopy, I think.
Great, thank you. Yeah, John, talk to us a little bit about what you've done. A lot of research on rolled versus standing and other termination efforts. What are you seeing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pretty unique perspectives we just heard on kind of delayed termination tactics. So I'll just kind of react to that in the context of crimping and residue management. I guess just to clarify, right, in this type of system, we're talking about the roller crimper is really residue management and not terminating the cover crop. You have to be at a very specific stage to be able to mechanically terminate cover crops well. And so we're always including or thinking about including a good burn down product in our program. And so the decision as far as whether to use a roller crimper or not, I think it becomes a more important question as you delay termination and start to plant into higher residue cover crops, right? So If you're in the habit of just planting into knee-high cereal rye or winter cereal, you may not be getting much benefit from having a crimper just because you're not able to produce much of a surface mulch by laying down that residue. So it becomes more important as you allow cover crops to advance in their growth stage. I will definitely agree with what everybody said here in general. Corn does not like to emerge into cover crop residues. Lots of research suggests that you start to see a yield response or a yield penalty either due to weed competition and a living cover crop is a weed at that point if it's emerging into a living cover crop. So we see that kind of etiolation effect in corn often when we don't roll crimp the cover crop. We do see kind of the etiolation effect that Clay suggested he sees as well with soybeans, but they're a little more plastic and perhaps less likely to see kind of a yield penalty associated with that. The work that we've done has focused on kind of considering those residue management strategies from, when you're thinking about crop establishment and what kind of impact it's having on crop establishment or early growth rates of crops, but also from a weed management perspective. And in theory, I think we would think that a roll crimped cover crop that's on the ground and you're getting all that residue on the surface probably does a better job of either preventing or delaying germination of small seeded annual species. We probably see more mortality of those weeds that are germinating and aren't able to survive and grow through the mulch. So more kind of seedling mortality when we're laying down the cover crop with a roll crimper. On the other hand, allowing the cover crop to stand may have less impact on those emergence dynamics, but it may have a greater impact on kind of early season growth rates if you have this established weed seedling that's in that canopy of a terminated standing cover crop. So there's two different things going on there. And we've looked at this in a couple different research trials. We've done some work. I know my colleagues, even the fellows on the phone here, Michael and Mark as well, have done this type of work at kind of what the weed management trade-offs are related to roll crimping or not. And so we have a couple years of data where we were doing this in corn. We have the same setup that Jim Hershey described, the ZRX roller crimper that we run on our planter. And we run those double disc row cleaners. We like that system ahead of corn because we like to do a little bit of row cleaning just to ensure good stand establishment and to maybe warm that in-row zone up as well. And so we compared that approach to roll crimping with like a front mounted kind of I&J style roller where we were using that without row cleaners, as well as just planting into standing rye that was maybe at the mid heading stage. And we kind of monitored kind of early season weed dynamics. And what we found is that when you're roll crimping with row cleaners, you might, roll cleaning or any type of in-row disturbance is going to invite some weed pressure. And so we saw about twice as many in-row weeds when we were row cleaning compared to either allowing the cover crop to stand or roll crimping without the row cleaners engaged. So more in-row weed pressure when you're using row cleaners, but we also saw greater weed suppression between the row when we were roll crimping. And then, so that's kind of generally what we found. This is all work that was done in the absence of using residual herbicides. So we're really focused on kind of those early season weed suppression dynamics.
Thanks, John. And this is a little off the termination topic, but I was glad to hear Jim Hershey mention that when he's planting green, higher cereal rye seeding rates is not actually really where you want to go. And I think you, John, you just published some research on that with Tiala Fix. that those higher cereal rye seeding rates were not worth the cost. Is that right?
Yeah, and we did that work really based on hearing from Jim and other folks that are planting green in Pennsylvania that kind of advocate for lower seeding rates, just and kind of considering what type of conditions they want to plant into. And we thought that there might be a trade-off there because research on growing cereal crops suggests that there might be a weed suppression benefit to using higher seeding rates, right? And so we are kind of extending that thought to that cover crop window. And in our region, one of our driver weeds is mare's tail or horseweed, which would be emerging in that fall period where we'd be sowing the cover crop. And so we looked at a range of seeding rates from 45 pounds of cereal rye through 120 pounds and tracked kind of winter annual weed suppression. And this is kind of a mid-October to late October sowing date window. And we didn't see any benefit in higher seeding rates as far as the level of horseweed suppression. Mark Van Gessel replicated some of those experiments in Delaware. He had different types of weed species, but what both of our sites showed as well is that we actually ended up, there's the weed suppression potential benefit of those winter annual weeds that are emerging with the growing cover crop. And then there's the question of, well, do we have a better surface mulch to plant into that provides a benefit for summer annual weeds? And the Delaware data and the Pennsylvania data, we had similar total biomass productivity from the cereal rye cover crop across, even at those low seeding rates. So that suggests that, if thinking about crop planting conditions first, like Jim Hershey suggests, is I think your first consideration, and our work suggests that you're not really potentially going to gain much weed suppression benefit from increasing the seeding rates.
Right. Thank you, John. So in this we've talked a little bit about this next section of questions while we're talking about termination for obvious reasons, because they're tied up together. But when you're planting your cash crop, I wonder if the farmer panel could talk about when you're working in these high biomass cover crops, the planting and stand establishment issues. How do you get around them? What are you using? And I know people have mentioned this. Let's start with the South, where, Clay, you're probably getting some of the biggest biomass of the group. What are you doing to sort of protect that emerging cash crop?
Yeah, well, first, John, I wish you could email that to like the soil and water districts and maybe NRCS for program qualification purposes. That'd be great. Because I agree with you, and it's also a saver on our. I mean, it's no need for us to spend the money for 2 bushels of rye if 50 pounds will do the job. But anyway, that's a side note. So what I plant with a Kinsey 3600, I went and I bought like a $40,000 planter, and I brought it home and I took all the chains off and everything, and we're running precision planting. So we're running hydraulic downforce, electric drives. I run Yetter shark tooth row cleaners. So they're sort of the swept back style, like sharp edge, which I think is pretty critical. I've never planted with the spoke style, the straight finger style, but it seems logical to me that the swept back sharper style would be, what you would want in heavy residue. My closing wheels are Yetter twisters. So they're poly closing wheels. Again, I don't know if you were in a high clay soil, I don't know how it would work, but in our soils, those poly twisters work really well. They don't wrap, and they sort of have pegs or notches that sort of close the trench, but they also, as they emerge, as they roll, they twist the soil. That sort of, it seems to improve, if you're planting in like slightly moist conditions and you come back and you get a sunny week on it, if you've seen that crack, that seed slot sort of open back up, these seem to really improve that, because they don't just poke it together, they sort of twist it and collapse the sidewall a little bit. And I've never had any issues with them wrapping. I guess, so I've also got rollers on the planter. We tried to make them roller crimpers, but they're essentially just rollers. I've done some experiments with them where we didn't spray like a burn down behind them to see how much would the rollers themselves kill the rye. Maybe 30 to 40%. Our homemade ones anyway. It doesn't actually kill it. It just kind of rolls it down. So I still have to spray behind it as well. But yeah, I mean, I'm typically running my row cleaners. I'm planting green and soybeans into rye, unless, like I said, if it turns off super hot and dry, we'll do what we have to do. We'll spray it. But my preferred method is to plant it green. Corn, I'm going to plant green into vetch. Same with cotton is the plan. Cotton is the most challenging because cotton you plant, your ideal planting depth is like 3/4 of an inch. So if you think of all the residue, if you get any ride up or anything at all changing on your planter, you're in trouble. So that's really where we focus in hard on it. But I'll say the vetch, we have planted it green and we have planted it crispy brown. And I have tried to plant it yellow, and it's like a rubber band. It's I think it was a farmer at a meeting said, plant it brown, plant it green, but not in between. And that's 100% right as far as what I've seen. It'll wrap on the row cleaners, it'll wrap on the closing wheels, everything, So I definitely agree with that. But yeah, as far as that's basically the management approach. That's how our planner's set up, and that's basically the approach we take.
Perfect. Thank you, Clay. Pennsylvania Jim, what are you doing when you're planning into heavy biomass?
Nothing fancy. I would agree with Clay there on the shark tooth row clean. The Yetter shark tooth row cleaners are about the best one out there in the market. If you're really going to plan into heavy biomass, we had them on the very first year before we had the roller crimper, and we had absolutely zero wrapping with those row cleaners. So if you don't have a roller system, or even if you do, shark tooth row cleaners do a very good job. I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is, these roller crimpers cost a lot of money. I mean, you're looking for a 12-row planter right now, you're looking $30,000 to $35,000 for a 12-row planter. And that's a huge commitment. If you're wanting to roll your cover crop, that vegetation, now in Clay's situation where he's using vetch is probably the easiest crop to roll. But if you're rolling a cereal grain, either be rye, triticale, wheat, any of those, if it's not in its reproductive stage, you don't get a real good, you're not going to be happy with the job a roller crimper does. So don't go spend the money unless you're really going to be committed long-term to be planting into high biomass. So the Case IH planter, you've seen that picture there of the row unit where it's got two smooth blades that do the row cleaning, and then the roller crimper. But then on the row unit itself, the closing wheels on the Case IH is different than any other planter, than Kinsey or John Deere, whereby it's got an 8-inch double closing wheel. We have tried probably a half a dozen different closing wheel systems. With that much biomass, it really takes an aggressive closing system to pull that furrow closed. And so it's got, you can't really see the closing system on there, But then the press wheel on the very back is just like an 8-inch rubber press wheel. Case IH, I would not brag about its seed singulation. I think they've got, well, now the newer planters, the ones that just come out in the last couple of years here, do an excellent job with the system that they got on now. But I haven't always had the fanciest stands as far as, I would say, spacing. Spacing is something we've worked at for many years, and we're just at the point now where we're committed to this planter because we have the rollers on. Should we not be rolling, I don't know if we'd have this planter or not. Yeah, it's got airbags on the planter unit. You can adjust your air depending on the conditions that you're planting in. One other challenging thing with planting into a system like this is that those depth wheels, it can sometimes be difficult depending on the variability of your biomass through the field as into what the planting depth will be. So you got to compensate, you got to set your planter according to what you think the median is going to be for that field. I don't have the technology to change depth on the go, but with this much biomass, you're going to be having those closing wheels most of the time are going to be running on top of that rolled cover. And so you really, it's a whole another level of management when you're planting into a system like this.
Definitely. So Wisconsin, Jim, anything to add? How are you handling seed bed preparation and such?
Yeah, before we talk about that, John, please include Wisconsin NRCS in that mailing on the seeding rate data, especially when rice 30 cents a pound. So you saw in my pictures the level of biomass that I'm dealing with. So it's not really a concern. My planter has Kinsey units. It's the old style equivalent to John Deere Max Merge. And I use Yetter row cleaners, fixed position row cleaners. They're manual adjust. When I upgrade, I'm going to get floating units on there. I was concerned. So you saw the picture of the residue I planted into last year, which was more than typical. And I didn't really experience wrapping. Typically, the row cleaner, if you get it set so it sweeps the residue, it'll pull out some of the plants, basically it just pushes them aside. And then for closing, I use an aftermarket chute manufacturing. It's not a shark tooth, but it's equivalent of a spike tooth. And again, by the time the row cleaners have pushed any residue to the side, I don't have an issue with wrapping. I imagine with my setup, with more residue, that would be something I'd have to address, but we don't have that problem here.
Great, thanks, John. Any final thoughts? Or otherwise, I think we might jump to the Q&A here, just because we're running into the 3 o'clock hour, and I want to be respectful of our panelists' time.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. We've seen, I think, tremendous improvement. We've moved to Delta Force precision plant, and I think that's made a big difference in just stand establishment and evenness of stands. And so we've been happy with that technology.
Great. Mark, did you want to start? I know you've been watching the Q&A. Do you want to start throwing out some questions here for our panelists?
Sure. Since we were on the topic of roller crimper, someone asked, are there certain cover crop species that the roller crimper doesn't work as well with? Anybody have some poor experiences with certain cover crop species?
Yeah, I'll speak up on that. Wheat is a very difficult species to roll. It is very strong, woody, as I might explain it, stem. And unless it is, like I said, mentioned earlier, if the cover crop is in its vegetative stage or its reproductive stage, then you'll have more success. Yeah, other than that, I mean, once you get into your legumes, they're the easiest ones to roll and keep down. Clay?
Yeah, I agree with the wheat, especially. I don't know if I think it varies between ryes, but I think it may be the stage of growth it's at. So if I plant a Canadian rye versus an Abruzzi rye, come planting time, the Canadian rye is 2 to 3 weeks later, and so it may not be at that productive reproductive stage. It makes it as easy to roll down. Seems harder to me. Oats, they're much more leafy than rye. Where rye is a much more stem-based crop, oats are much leafier. So they kind of present a little bit of a challenge. I really love what it does to radishes, especially if the radish is sticking out of the soil. It just smashes it and explodes it. It seems like to me rye or any grass crop rolls down better if vetch is in the mix with it. So, if you get to a part of the field where the vetch didn't thrive for some reason, you see a little bit more where if the plants aren't quite ready to the ideal condition or growth stage to roll down, they'll stand back up a little bit. Whereas if it's a heavy vetch growth, it seems to help hold them down for whatever reason. And I totally agree. The legumes roll down the easiest. They're just very wet, soft tissue plants that, you can almost just step on them and knock them down. That's what I've seen.
Unless Wisconsin Jim has anything to add, I'll just add a little bit to that. That involved in some organic no-till research where we're focused on using the roller crimper as the sole means for termination. I see Bill Kearns on the call, and he's basically done a lot of that early work that demonstrated that your kind of peak as far as what you can accomplish with cereal rye is you have to be in that anthesis stage to really get effective termination, and with hairy vetch about 70% flowering. And so with those crops, allowing them to advance and grow stage, you start to see better success with the roller crimper. And just anecdotally, it's like part of roller crimping is when you have gravity on your side, right? So these larger allowing kind of cereal rye compared to wheat, so rye having a higher growth habit or a taller growth habit. Once you get it advanced in that growth stage, when it lays down, it doesn't want to stand up quite as easy. And the same goes for vetch. And we've seen the mixtures too. I think when vetch is growing in mixture with the cereal and is kind of vining up the cereal, that makes for better crimping activity than when it's it doesn't have anything to vine up, and it ends up being kind of wet and is laying closer to the surface. You're not really getting very good crimping activity when you're doing that.
Great, thanks guys. Mark, what other questions are you ready to throw our way?
So someone had mentioned, it might have been Clay, of having good luck with glyphosate by itself for burning down vetch. Is the two Jims had similar experience with it? There was a question as to not being effectively controlled with just glyphosate by itself and needed some 2,4-D with vetch.
Yeah, I don't feel like in our area, it just doesn't seem like glyphosate will take out vetch. Almost needs 2,4-D or something besides.
Are you, this is Clay. It may be, so mine typically is flowering. When I spray it, I don't know if that makes it easier or harder to kill. But yeah, I think we've definitely seen glyphosate take it out. But typically we will run an auxin with it too. I think I mentioned that when most of our burn downs, because most of our mixes aren't just vetch, it's other species in there as well. And so, it'll either be a Liberty included or some type of auxin, and usually in my case it's dicamba. So it's rare that I have done just glyphosate, but I have seen it kill it at flowering with maybe a quart rate of the PowerMax 3, I believe. I'm not quite sure what percentage that is, but yeah.
Yeah, so we would recommend, we typically would recommend having an auxin in the tank if you are if you either have legumes or brassicas that you're trying to kill at burn down. It's not to say that glyphosate won't be effective in certain conditions. It's just we see greater consistency with having either 2,4-D or dicamba in the tank.
So I think most of the panelists talked about growing cover crop as a crop and managing that as a cover crop. So a question came in about weed control for the cover crop, either pre-planting the cover crop or maybe even post-planting. Is weed control to get your cover crop up and going an issue for any of you? And if so, how are you handling that?
We do not do any kind of weed management in planting cover crops. There was early on, I thought, we need to take out that competition, but my agronomist said, hey, chickweed is a good cover. Why are you going to destroy it? So honestly, we haven't really dealt with those late season weed pressure that come on late in the season. And so I'm not sure that we would even have a good reason to go in, even the way it is now.
I'll just throw in there, Jim, just from observing, you're 100% cover crop acres, right? So your farm is basically almost continuous living cover. And so a lot of those, the chickweeds and some of the winter annuals that really thrive in those fallow conditions, you don't have too many spots where those winter annual weeds are really going to take hold on in your rotation. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why you can get away without much kind of pre-plant burn down management ahead of cover crops is because of, that you're completely covered.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like to us, the earlier we can get it established, the less issue the weeds are. But where we are, I have sprayed, if I'm later getting it in, if it's November and it's still hot and it hadn't frosted, we're going to have grass and weeds. And so I have sprayed like a burn down before, but you really need to be careful with that because of if it's anything besides glyphosate or a contact, you got to kind of really read your label to see whether you're running any residual issues.
So I personally haven't done it, but some of my cooperators will manage, and this is not for the cover crop, but in the rye, they will spray to manage mare's tail, the winter annual. So in Wisconsin, we have winter annual and we can have the summer annual. So if they get a flush post-harvest and the cover crop's there, they will spray in the fall in the standing cover crop. And likewise, they will spray before planting the rye just to make sure that doesn't get a hold and is there the next spring. But that's not so much related to the cover crop as it is the effect on the grain crop and weed management the following year.
Are any of you doing actual measurements of the soil as well, as far as looking at microbial populations, changes in microbial populations with your cover cropping?
I'm scheduled to work with a partner to do some of that this year. We've never done it before, but we're going to do some. We hope to take some comparisons to maybe a farm that we haven't been farming that long, that's been in tillage, and kind of compare it to a long-term field and just see if we can see any difference. But we have yet to do it yet. No, but I hope to do that in the next couple of weeks.
We haven't been doing anything, although that's maybe an encouragement. Maybe I can get someone from Penn State, John, to do a 3 or 5 year study for us there on our farm. But there was a program a number of years ago that an agronomist was doing, and I'm not sure why he didn't continue it, but that was 5 years ago. They did a test in microbial activity in our one field, and the only thing they told me was that the numbers were off the chart. So where it is today, I don't know. I would hope that they're as good or better, but that's great encouragement to try and get something going.
So I haven't done it either, and I told you early on, I drank the soil health Kool-Aid a long time ago. So what I look for is functionality in my system. So the biggie to me is infiltration. So if we get a real heavy rain, are my field ponds disappearing sooner than my neighbors, especially the ones that are in conventional tillage, but also the no-tillers around me. And also I go out when I'm scouting early to mid-season, I'm looking after heavy rains to see if there's any evidence of surface flow. And the idea being that if I got infiltration, I'm not going to see evidence of water movement. So it's things like that that I'm looking for. But the specific tests, no, I've never done anything.
All right. Do we have time for one more, Emily?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
am going to put up our final slide for anyone who's trying to get CEU credits from this, just so they can go ahead and grab that while our panelists continue to talk.
So everyone's talked about weed control and improved weed control with cover crops being one of the reasons for using it. So with your experience now with this, where have you seen that you've been able to cut back on herbicides? Either, is that in terms of fewer products you're using, fewer applications per year? Where are you seeing that savings then, if you are seeing a savings in your herbicide input by using cover crops?
Go ahead, Jim from Wisconsin.
So I do not reduce rates. Where it shows up with me is if I can get away with fewer post in season, so post emergence applications. But I am reluctant to cut rates just because of the resistance problem.
So we have reduced our residual herbicide. We have been using pretty steady an Acheron program, along with glyphosate, atrazine, Acuron's labeled rate is, I think, 3 1/4 quart. We are applying 1 1/4 quart. And we've been doing this for a number of years and doing it with other residual herbicides as well. The maximum, we try and stick to 24 ounces of glyphosate at any one application. Occasionally we will go up to 32 ounces, but that being the max. So yeah, with herbicide costs where they're at, of course, they have backed off some here this spring. But yeah, I feel like we've been able to reduce our rates with the high biomass heavy cover crop program.
Yeah, I'm a little more echoing what Wisconsin Jim is saying. It may be possible. I've just been scared to try it as far as a rate reduction, just because I don't want, I feel like I'm risking flaring more resistance within weed species. So I've been sort of scared to try it. I do think we can get away if I get the rye like I want it. I'm still going with residuals because I want that 6 weeks to try to get my soybeans, say, in a big rye stand, to try to get them canopied and sort of shading out, and hopefully where I can see my savings, and oftentimes do, is in another post application. I can sort of eliminate that. Occasionally I'll need a glyphosate, around the edges or something to beat back some crabgrass. We have a lot of issues with crabgrass here. But where I'm seeing savings, I think, is oftentimes the elimination of a second or even sometimes third post application, just depending on how late in the year it gets and how, it all depends on the biomass. But if I can get the biomass, we've often been able to eliminate a post spray.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we are at time now. And
Emily,
yes,
I just want to bring up something that I'm surprised it didn't surface today.
okay.
And I don't think we have a lot of time to go in depth, but it'd be interesting what Jim and Clay had any experiences with slugs. That is I think the number one question that comes up. Well, this is an excellent, habitat for slugs. And I know John, he lives and breathes slugs probably in his research too, but I'll just say in a couple of words, or maybe a sentence, is that we did some research, side-by-side research, and slugs do not bother corn or soybeans in a heavy cover crop environment like this. That was our experience.
That's interesting.
But yeah, usually that's a question comes up at all the farmer meetings when you're talking about cover crops. Oh, how do you deal with the slugs? But
you think they just get their fill with everything else out there, or?
Yes. So
Yeah.
they've got other the residue to forage on, and they don't know the difference between green or cover crop and corn, and they typically have not bothered the corn.
That's great. John, have you seen any of that? Is there any research on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. My colleague John
Yeah.
Zucker has done quite a bit of research on this, and would suggest the same thing that Jim just described. So one, it's an alternative food source. Two, you're more likely to have beneficial arthropods that might provide some top-down control on slugs as well. And so his message, I've heard it enough that I could summarize it, is cover crops in a no-till system, cover crops and delaying cover crop termination, probably also delaying cash crop planting. There's a benefit as far as slug suppression. He would also advocate taking seed treatments out where possible because of their impact on those beneficial arthropods that might provide some slug suppression. So it's a complete IPM kind of approach to managing slugs, and you can do that in a cover crop system.
Great. Thank you, Jim, for that last minute comment. Well, I want to let our panelists go because you guys have been very generous with your time and expertise. This was a great range of experience and geography. So thank you so much. This recording will be posted on our website next week in our news page posts. So please check it out there. And again, growiwm.org. If you want to go and subscribe, that'll land directly in your inbox next week. So I would encourage you to do that. But otherwise, thank you everybody so much and have a great rest of the day.